Hello, in this tutorial we're going to look at the next sort of heat exchanger core design, and this core design is going to have multiple different domains in it. So a while ago GE created this heat exchanger inside here, and this heat exchanger has essentially three domains, and this type of heat exchanger is very useful for sort of air to liquid applications, or essentially applications when the two fluids going through the heat exchanger have different Reynolds numbers. So inside here, if we analyze the geometry, what we have is one domain here. We have an intersecting domain, so two lattices intersecting each other, and we have the internal domain of this lattice here. And then we have a third domain around the outside of everything, which is, I guess, where the second fluid will go through. So let's take a look at how we can recreate a similar geometry with multiple domains using Gen3D's latticing tools. So let's begin. So in this case, we're just going to use a planar cube geometry. If you wanted to do the complex sort of outer shape to that heat exchanger, you could do that and bring that in as an imported model into the software. But in this case, I'm just going to start by creating a primitive cube in the center of the base plate with side lengths of 50 millimeters. And to that, I am going to click on the Lattice tab, and then I'm going to add a surface lattice component to that primitive cube. Now in this case, we want to modify some of the settings inside here to get sort of as close as possible to the heat exchanger that we've just seen. So the lattice type we're going to modify from a gyroid surface to a Schwartz D surface, diamond based lattice. We're then going to click on absolute size, and then set the number of cells in each of the axes to be 2. So we want 2 cells in each of the axes. And then we're just going to customize the origin of this lattice, which isn't strictly necessary, but again, we want to try and match the original design as close as possible. So to do that, I will click the Customize Origin button, and that gives me access to this coordinate system here. I'll click on the Tools tab, click on the Transform panel, and then rotate X and set that to be -45 degrees. Then I'll press Execute to rotate the axis about the X-axis, and we can see that's modified in here now. So we're good to go. So if we look back at this heat exchanger design again, what we essentially have is 2 intersecting lattice structures. And we've already done a tutorial to that, so you can find that on our YouTube page or our tutorials page. And these intersecting lattices are then hollow, so that we can allow the fluids to pass through them. So firstly, what we'll do is focus on one domain of this heat exchanger. So to do that, we're going to open up the problem component and get access to the surface lattice. And then we're going to play around with this density value. So in this case, I'm going to set it to be 0.35. So let's just look at what this is when I generate. So we'll generate this at a resolution of 0.3, so we can generate this in real time. Here we have a solid strut here. We want to make this hollow. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll create a copy of this lattice by clicking on the cube inside the models drop down, and I'll press Ctrl C for copy and Ctrl V for paste. Then I have this surface lattice with these parameters, and I'll just lower the ISO value or the density value down to 0.25. So I'm moving the walls inwards, and then I'm going to subtract that from the first lattice by unticking the solid box. So let's see what we have when I generate this. So now we have opened up essentially the surface inside here to allow a fluid to pass through. So looking back, we now have created one of the domains of this intersecting heat exchanger. So the next stage is to create the intersecting lattice to this one. So reset, so we go back to our lattice. So I want to create a copy of both of these lattices and then generate the inverse of what I've just created. So I'm going to select both of these lattices by clicking on one, holding down the Control key and clicking on the second one. And then I'll create a copy by pressing Control C, Control V. So I've now got the other two. And to illustrate what the difference between these lattices are, I'm just going to drag these two out so we can see both of the lattices side by side. So next thing, what I want to do is then set both of these lattices to be the inverse of the first two. So I'm going to check the inverse box on both of these. And then because I've now got the inverse, I need to swap the density values over so they're essentially the other side of 0.5. So in this case, I want a 0.65 density value, and I want a 0.75 density value. And then I want to subtract the larger number away from the smaller number. And I'll generate this again. This one will take slightly longer to generate because now I've got 4 lattices to create rather than just 3. But here you can see now we've got one domain, and where there's a gap in the first domain, I've got a new domain, and where there's a gap in the second domain, the first one fills that in. So now I'll set these lattices to be back on top of each other. So to do that, I'll click on one of the lattices that I've moved, click on the transform panel, transform button in the tools tab, click on copy transform from, and then click on one of the first 2 lattices and repeat that for the second one I've just moved. So now we've got all of the 4 lattices on top of each other, and I can now generate the multiple domains of my heat exchanger. Just generates each of these lattices. So here you can see the 4 domains, or the 2 domains that are intersecting with each other. And because these are separate bodies, essentially, to bring this all together, we need a wall around the outside of this heat exchanger. So I'll bring a body in that I've created in CAD earlier. So I'm going to click Import. And I'm going to just bring in a second body. And I will bring this into the same position so it's overlapping using my transform panel. And then I want this to be a solid wall surrounding the outside of this heat exchanger. So I'll set that to be a solid in the geometry tab. And then I'll generate my final model of this heat exchanger. So here we have the lattices, and I can apply a smoothing operation to this. So what we have is similarly to the original heat exchanger, which we've got one domain and we have a second domain next to that. And then we have the third domain going around the outside of all of these tubes. So this is how you create multi-domain heat exchangers using Gen 3D's latticing tools. Thank you for watching.